Please join me in welcoming Daniel L. Goroff to deliver his lecture on behavioral economics, designing experiments that have policy applications. Daniel?
Thank you very much.
Is it on?
Thank you very, very much, and thanks so much for this invitation to speak with you all tonight. It's really a pleasure to be with so many new and old friends, and I really appreciate everyone coming out on an evening like this to hear about behavioral economics. So the first thing I should tell you is that the views expressed are not necessarily those of the Alfred B. Sloan Foundation, but they should be. And you heard a little bit about the Sloan Foundation. I hope people know that we were put together by Alfred P. Sloan, and he's the person who ran General Motors for many, many years. And then he started the foundation, and with instructions to fund research and a modest amount of outreach as well in the fields of science, technology, and economics. And so we are, in fact, one of the original and also continuing funders of the whole field of behavioral economics. So that's part of the background for this. I should also say that the views expressed are not necessarily those of the speaker, at least not originally, but rather of many of the researchers, some of whom have been supported by the Sloan Foundation from very early on, but others who have just contributed to this field. So it's not necessarily my work that I'm talking about, but it is a spin on all of this and a way of putting it together that I hope you might find compelling. So the big theme I want to talk about is economics and evidence, and how evidence can be used, as we were saying just a moment ago, for policy, and how people use data and make decisions to achieve their own goals. And when I taught actually some of this material with a Harvard Business School professor named Howard Rafa, who made a tremendous difference to my view of the world, one of the things that he told me is that it's always important to distinguish between the normative, the descriptive, and the prescriptive. The normative is how people ideally should behave in theory, and traditional economics spends a lot of time on that. The descriptive is when you actually go out and look, what do people do? And that's something that is very much associated with behavioral economics. And then the prescriptive is what should you do? How do you help people actually get a little better at what they want to do? And that's the policy aspect of this that I want to talk about a little bit more. So those are the three things to keep in mind. And to begin with, I want to talk especially about decision makers and about individuals and what we know now from behavioral economics about the ways that individuals make decisions. And then the second part, I'll talk more about decision posers, about policymakers and people who frame the decisions that we have to make. And so this theme runs around, throughout the talk about individual behavior versus what if everybody did that? Okay, so that's the big picture here. And let me start off with a question and just ask you, suppose that you know that Tom is either a salesman or a librarian, okay? One or the other. And someone tells you, who's quite reliable, that his personality has been described as quiet. So which is more likely? Librarian. Salesman? One librarian. Yes. Okay, so almost everybody says librarian, right? Okay, so that's what everybody says. How would you test whether this is a good answer? Yeah, you could ask him. But what would it mean to be a good answer? You'd have to think about doing this a lot of times, maybe, trying to figure out whether this really works for you, this kind of strategy, right? Okay, so then you'd have to take a lot of Toms, have to think about a lot of Toms, and randomly pick them somehow, and then see if they turn out to be, right? You know, you'd have to pick them, see if they're quiet, and then see what happens. Okay. How would you pick salesmen or librarians? I mean, if you pick them at random from the population of the United States, so what would you find? I mean, so let me ask you a different question. So, oops, that's the wrong direction. Right, let me ask you a different question. This one's about Fred. All you know about Fred is that he's either a salesman or a librarian. That's all you know. Nothing about his personality. Now what would you say? What's more likely? Salesman or a librarian? Okay, so most people say salesman, right? Why do you say that? There's a lot more salesmen, and you can look this up at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it turns out there's about 100 times as many salesmen as there are librarians in the United States. Okay? You're still not convinced?
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, no, what? Yeah, we're talking.
But then you still don't, even if that be the case, you still don't know whether your original question was salesman or librarian.
No, it's true. But you can ask yourself, are there any quiet librarians? Are there any quiet salesmen? Right? Okay, so that's the next thing you want to ask yourself. But, yes?
Well, if the selection criterion is you go to a sales conference and to a librarian's conference and you find a salesman who's quiet long enough where you can ask him, and you ask for volunteers from the librarians, the one who speaks up is the one you pick.
That might work. That absolutely might work. That absolutely might work. However, the problem was as stated, which is all you know is that there's either a salesman or a librarian, and that the person's personality is quiet. Okay? So this, I would argue, is a really important kind of a problem that we meet in life all the time. You have some information, and then you get some more information, and you have to update somehow. Okay? So you have to do what's called conditional probability. What's the probability conditioning on the fact that this person is quiet? You know that there are salesmen and everything, but you have to bring in some more information. So let me just very quickly just give you the idea of conditional probability. And really all I want you to do, if you want to look at the mathematical notation here, is to know that when I write PR of A / B, that's the probability of A given B. Okay? And it's defined as the probability of A and B both happening. So in other words, the intersection of A and B divided by the probability of B. Okay, so if you want to follow along with that, that's fine. But the thing I mostly want you to notice is that this is the probability of, say, red given blue. So you know you're in the blue over there. What would you say is the probability of red if you know that you're in the blue?
50%.
It's about 50%. Right? Because we're talking about the purple part here. That would represent, given that you're in blue, what's the probability of being red? Maybe it's about half the. Okay, what's the probability of blue given red?
15%.
10%.
I don't know, 10%, a sixth, something like that. Okay? But the important thing is that these two numbers are different. And they mean something quite different.
That blue is smaller than red.
Just on the assumption that yeah, well, okay, if they were the same two sets, then of course it would be the same. But just in this sort of picture, and this would be the typical kind of picture you would expect, you can see that these two things are different. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So then there's something that you do with this, and this is due to the Reverend Bayes, who's looking at us right there. So it goes back a long time. And if you just use that definition, you can come up with what's called Bayes' law, and so this is Bayes' law, and we'll see it in a few different places. But the key thing that you want to do is you want to update given this data. So think of D as the data. So I know something about the probability of A and the probability of B. I want to know what's the probability of A given the new data that I got. This is life, okay? I knew something about the salesman. I get new data that this person is quiet, and I have to update. So everything that we do all the time is about learning, right? This is what we have to do, and this is the way Bayes said you have to do it. And it's just a matter of clearing out the numerators and rewriting this. There's no mathematics to this. It's just a little bit of notation. Okay, and I'll just tell you that this, I'll just call your attention to the original ratio of the probabilities of A and B, before you know anything, is called the base rate. Okay, this is called the base rate. And then you're interested in the ratio of those probabilities when you now have this data, when you've done this updating. Okay? And this factor over here is what is called the Bayes ratio. And you notice that the difference is that these two things have been flipped. This is the probability of the data given the event. And what I want to find is the probability of the event given the data. Got that? All right, let me just show you what this looks like. Forget about the notation and everything. So if we look at this, if there are 100 times as many salesmen and we make all those squares gray, then you can just barely see on the upper left there are some white squares. There's 10 of them. Okay, so there's 1,000 squares in this grid, and I colored all the salesmen that are represented by this gray, and in the upper left there's just 10 of them. Okay? Let's say, so that's what we know before anything happens, before we hear about anyone being quiet or something. And let's just say that, look, we all know that salesmen are probably louder than librarians. And if you're a librarian, you're probably quiet, right? So let's just say that maybe 1 in 10 librarians are not quiet, and maybe that 1 in 10 salesmen is actually quiet. Okay? That seems, I mean, there are some exceptions to any rule, so let's say it's like 1 in 10. Okay, so now look at this. I've colored blue the quiet salesman because we said 1 in 10, right? So there are a lot of them. There's about 100 of them, right? And there's 9 quiet librarians, and there's 1 white spot that's left up there, and that happens to be a noisy librarian, okay? Now, where are the quiet people here? The quiet people are colored in. They're either blue or red, right? Now, if I randomly chose among these things, if I know that I'm in the colored part here, what's more likely? Am I looking at a librarian or am I looking at a salesman? It's much more likely that I'm looking at a salesman who happens to be quiet, who's only 1 in 10, right? But who happens to be quiet, than the fact that I'm looking at a librarian. Okay? Everybody's nodding? You see that? Okay. All right, so this is this case, you know, it's sort of like all librarians are quiet. This guy is quiet. Therefore, he's a librarian, is what everybody wants to say. It's sort of like saying, all cows eat grass, Sally is an animal that eats grass. It follows that Sally is... Everybody wants to say a cow, but we all know that that really doesn't follow, because Sally, after all, could be a goat. Okay? So it doesn't follow, even though people kind of want to confirm things that way. On the other hand, if you say all cows eat grass and Susie is an animal that does not eat grass, right, then what follows from that? Susie is not a cow. That's valid, okay? And we'll see that later when we talk about hypothesis testing and so on. All right, so this is the kind of thing that economists are really interested in. And it turns out it's not just about salesmen and librarians. This is something that comes up all the time and that people get mixed up about all the time, and that nature actually wired us to get mixed up about. And I'll give you just an example, say a business example. This is an actual article from Management Focus magazine a while ago, and they did a survey of CEOs. And they found that 85% of the CEOs had a pet when they were a kid. And what did the article say? Said you should run out and buy your kid a pet, right? Because then that'll help them become a CEO. So what's the problem with this? They mixed up the probability of having a dog given that you're a CEO, which is what they actually went out and measured, because they just talked to CEOs, with the probability of becoming a CEO given that you had a dog, which probably is not all that big. Okay? So it's exactly the same sort of thing. And this was their pet theory that, almost all CEOs had dogs. Your kid has a dog. Therefore, he's going to be a CEO, right? Okay, but people think this way, and even, editors let this kind of thing through. And if you look for it in the newspaper, you'll see it. Yes?
Well, this still says that the probability of being a CEO given that you had a dog is greater than the probability of being a CEO given that you didn't have a dog.
Maybe yes and maybe no. Maybe yes and maybe no. Think about it. All right, let me give you one more example of this. And this is a legal kind of a case. And it's actually a famous problem. You can look this up and some of these other problems in lots of books, and I have names of them. But the idea is that there's a taxi that was involved in a hit-and-run accident at night. And there are two companies in the town, a blue cab company that has 15% of the taxis and a green cab company that has 85%. Now, there's a witness who was at the scene. It was kind of a foggy night. Visibility wasn't so good, but the witness says that the cab was blue. So you take the witness out under certain similar circumstances, foggy night, same distance, and so on. You show him a bunch of cabs, and it turns out the witness is correct about 80% of the time. Okay? So what would you say if you're the judge? Should you find the blue cab guilty? No. How many people say guilty? Okay. All right. How would you find the green cab guilty? No, you don't know. Nobody's voting. You really don't know? What do you think most people would say? Most people say blue. And why do they say blue? So the witness is right 80% of the time. What do you want from me? Right? So the witness is right 80% of the time. Why not do it? But what are they ignoring? If you just talk about the witness, then you're ignoring the base rate. Okay, the original probability, if I just told you, wait a second, forget about any accident or anything else like that. There are two cabs. I don't know which it was. What's more likely, a green cab or a blue cab? Then you know immediately from what we've been talking about. First of all, you could do this kind of calculation, but if you just drew 1,000 cabs like this, then 85% of them are all the green ones there, and then 15% of them are the three lines at the bottom that are blue. So overwhelmingly, you know what I'm going to say now, right? That if there are a fifth of the green cabs are mistaken as blue, and I colored those in red at top, and then a fifth of the blue cabs are mistaken as green. Those are the white ones at the bottom. So if you ask which are the cabs in this picture that the witness would have said are blue, it's all the red ones and all the real blue ones. The red ones aren't actually blue, but the witness said so, right? And okay, so now if you're talking about randomly picking between the reds and the red and the blues, what's more likely, that you're going to pick out a red one or a blue one?
Right.
No, there's an extra line up on the top, right? So it's much more likely that the witness was actually looking at a green cab that they mistakenly thought was blue. Okay? You see that now? Okay. All right, so people do funny things, and you can also look at this mathematically. I'll give you another example, just to cover some bases here. If you think about going to the doctor. This is really serious. You go to the doctor, for example, and you're pregnant, and you think you might have been exposed to German measles. And you say to the doctor, gee, is this serious? I heard there's a birth defect that goes along with this. And the doctor says to you, yeah, I've seen that birth defect. And almost every time that there's a baby born with that, we kind of ask around and everything, and it turns out that the mother was exposed to German measles while she was pregnant. So you walk out of the office and you think, oh boy, now what do I do? But then you think a little bit harder and you remember this lecture and you think, what did the doctor actually answer? They told you the probability of having been exposed given that you had the birth defect. Right? What did you want to know? You wanted to know the probability of the birth defect given that you were exposed. On the other hand, this is very natural because when the only reason why the doctor gets interested in this is when they see this birth defect, right? And then they go and they ask around, and it helps them form a theory of how these things happen by asking around. It's completely natural. what would you have to do if you wanted to test the theory that, that the exposure led to this birth defect, or how probable that was? Well, you'd have to set up an experiment. You'd have to find a whole bunch of pregnant women who had been exposed to German measles, and then track how many of the kids ended up with a birth defect and how many of them, thank goodness, were perfectly healthy. But unless you went to the trouble of assembling that population and following it through, there's no way that the doctor would ever notice that. And so it's very easy for people to confuse these two concepts in their mind. And so this is one of the things, it's one of many things that, and I'm focusing on this, and you'll see why. There are many, many parts of behavioral economics, but this is at least one of the things that people do, which, now that we've talked about it, you can see, and if you read in the newspapers, you'll find lots of examples of this. And then as you go through the rest of your life, every once in a while you'll realize that you just did the same thing again. Because even if you talk about it, this is the way our brains work. Yes?
But I've read these people who make the opposite mistake. They only look, they say, oh, these other guys are wrong, you can't tell. I only look at the base rate. The base rate tells you what the probability is going to be, so that's also wrong.
Well, if you accept the definition I wrote down of conditional probabilities, then you have to accept, just by doing a little bit of canceling, the way that you should update the base rate to get the odds. Okay? So you can say that if you want, but I'll give you a couple of examples of what people do when they get the data. And just to show you that this is not the strangest thing that happens when you start doing behavioral economics and you start doing experiments and looking at how people actually use data and how they actually make decisions. So here's an experiment where you can divide up the class. So I say, I give a handout to this side of the class, and I say do you think the population of Turkey is greater than or less than 35 million? Okay, and you write, and then I ask, what do you think the population of Turkey is? And you write down your guess, okay? So you do that on a piece of paper. And the other half of the lecture hall, I say, okay, I give you a piece of paper and it says, do you think the population of Turkey is greater or larger than 65 million? Okay, they got 35 million, you got 65 million. And then I say, what do you think the population of Turkey is? Okay? What do you think is the difference between the two numbers that you get from either side? On this side, they give you a much bigger number. Nobody on this side is going to write down 65. Nobody on this side is going to write down 35. But you write down a number that's close to it, almost everybody. So on this side, what you'll find if you actually do this is that people write down 20, 25, 40, things like that. And on this side, people will write down 70, 90, 50, things like that. But very, very different numbers that you get just because of that information. And so that's how people sometimes use new information. And it's called anchoring or priming. And so there are all kinds of examples like this. And in this case, you don't have a real theory, so you try to make up something with whatever data is on hand. But there are even stranger things that you find when you start doing behavioral economics. And this was actually done, I don't know how they thought of this, but it was done with undergraduates at a very fine university, and they sat them down and they asked them, how many countries do you think there are in Africa that are members of the UN? They start thinking, they say, wait, before you answer that, let's see what this carnival wheel says. They had a carnival wheel standing there that was rigged so that it stopped either at 35 or 65. And they spun the carnival wheel and they said, oh, the wheel says 35. What do you say? And guess what happens? All the numbers that you get from the people who saw 35 are kind of close to 35. And all the people who saw it on a carnival wheel, okay, that said 65, they think about it for a minute and they say, oh, well, yeah, I guess about 70 countries or something. So this has been reproduced in lots and lots of different ways, and I can give you more examples like this, but I just find all this very amusing. And these two things should be independent. And in terms of this conditional probability, what we're talking about is that the probability of there being 100 members given this data from the wheel should be exactly the same as the probability of there being 100 members of the UN from Africa without the wheel. Okay? So that's a definition of when people say these two probabilistic events are independent, that's the definition. So you can see it in terms of this conditional probability we've been talking about. Okay, so why would you do this? You do these sorts of things because they're easy, because they're quick, because lots of other people do it. Lots of other people do it, right? And sometimes you're even right. I mean, even on the taxi cab thing, sometimes you're right, or with the salesman, and you might be right, and then it really reinforces things, right? So there's a lot of reasons why people do these sorts of things, but you would kind of like to believe that if you had this rule of following carnival wheels, that if you did it enough, you'd begin to notice that this really wasn't working for you, because it really isn't a good way of doing things. But even that, when you start doing these experiments on how people use data and how they use evidence, and even silly examples like this, turns out that actually people are not easily disabused, because they tend not to look for data, and they don't even notice, they don't even see data that would be incompatible with their preconceived beliefs. Okay, so let me give you a little example of this. You hear about an analyst who makes weekly predictions of the stock market. And you're told that every time this analyst gives a favorable prediction, the next week the market goes up. That's the claim, all right? Now, you want to test that claim, that every time this guy says it goes up, next week it goes up. And fortunately for you, you got lots of data. The data is that every week when he says whatever he says, he writes it down on a card. Okay? He says favorable or unfavorable. Writes it down on the card. The next week he turns the card over and he writes down whether it went up or down. Okay? So there are all these cards. So you want to just test this claim about his predictive abilities, and these cards are now stacked into different piles. And let's imagine you have to pay, I don't know, $100 or something to read one of these stacks. Which stacks would you want to read if you want to check on this claim? All right? So there's stack 1 all have faces that say it was a favorable prediction. And if you select that stack, you can look on the other side. Okay? Stack 2 all say an unfavorable prediction. And if you select that one, you pay $100 and you can look on the other side. All right? So those are the 4 stacks. Which stacks would you want to read to check that claim?
Market rise.
Okay, so you want to check stack 3 that says that the market rises. Okay? Other people, how many people would check stack 3? Okay, and what would you do with stack 3? You'd look at it, and you'd look at the back, and some of them would say it went up, some of them would say it went down, right? So if it said it went up and it went up, then that's good. If it said it went down, but it went up, right? I mean, in all of these, the market rises, right? If it had an unfavorable, right? If it had an unfavorable prediction, but a favorable outcome, does that tell me anything? Actually, doesn't tell me anything. Because the only thing, I don't know anything about what happens when he makes an unfavorable prediction. All I know is about what happens when he makes what the claim is what happens when he makes a favorable prediction. So in fact, you kind of wasted your money if you looked at stack 3. But that's the one that almost everybody says that they want to look at that one. But it has nothing to do with the claim. It will not help you check. You need to look at 2 stacks. Which ones?
Good question, isn't it?
Let's hold questions until the end. Rudy?
Okay.
Yeah, the acoustics not very good in the room, so let's.
Okay. All right. Well,
Thank you.
all right, so I'll tell you which stacks you want to look at. You want to look at number one, right? Because if he made a favorable prediction, you got to look through all of those, turn them over, and see, right, whether it actually the market went up. But you also have to look at number four, okay? Most people don't say number four. Why do you have to look at number four? Because if the market fell and you turn it over and you find that he made a prediction that would go up, then that means that the claim is false, okay? But almost no one ever thinks that they have to look at stack number four because they don't really want to look for disconfirming evidence, okay? And this has been done with people with PhDs in statistics. I mean, all kinds of experiments like this that have been done, and people just never want to look for, and they don't even see the evidence that they could easily find in front of them for anything that might disconfirm their beliefs. So this is called the confirmation bias. So let me sum up where we are. There are all these behavioral insights that people have done, and there are many, many more. I've just picked out a few of them, of how people actually make decisions and how they actually use data and how they actually look for evidence and don't look for evidence when you're an individual making a decision. So, and some of these at least are a little surprising. Anyway, if you're an economist and you take economics seriously, for a classical economist, most of these things just make no sense and are pretty surprising. But you can see that more than data enters into these sorts of things, and that depending on how you structure the decision, the way that you present it to people, and the term of art here is depending on the choice architecture, that people will do this or that. So that we're surprisingly sensitive to things that normally economists who think about dollars and cents, it has nothing to do with dollars and cents. It just has to do with the way that we pick up on lots of other cues and lots of other things that are going on. And so heuristically, some of the other key factors is that you decide to do things because they're easy, because they're attractive, because they're social, or because they're timely. And this is a great lesson that has been learned from all of this. And the first letters of those spell out east. And that this is just a way of remembering that those are factors. If you're designing experiments, or if you're designing policies, or if you're trying to understand why people might decide this way or that way, if you make things easy, attractive, social, and timely, you're much more likely to get the kind of decision that has those characteristics than otherwise. Okay, so you can use that to nudge people. So nudging is a term of art. It's the title of a book by Cass Sunstein and Dick Thaler. But you can use these kinds of heuristics about behavior to design better policies. And I would say that nudging is the art of posing these decisions or doing the choice architecture, if you will, so that without limiting anybody's choices, you improve the likelihood that decision makers will achieve the goals that they themselves would say that they want to accomplish. And so you haven't changed anybody's choices, so this is actually a kind of a libertarian view of things. You're not saying you can't do this, or you've got to make this choice or anything else like that. But it has a kind of a paternalism to it because you nudge people in the direction that they think that, or would say that they actually want to do. And you can think of lots of examples of things like this, say dieting, or saving for retirement, or finding a new job, or giving to charity. These are things where if you ask people, would you like to eventually do this? They'd say, sure, next week, right? And then the next week they say, yeah, no, I really want to do that, but next week. So if you could make it a little bit easier for people to do this by using some of these observations about how people actually make decisions, then you can be a paternalistic libertarian and a behavioral economist, okay? And I mean, just a simple example of dieting, it turns out that, and this is no surprise to anybody who ever thought about how things are arranged in a grocery store, but if you have say a cafeteria and in a school, and you put the desserts first, and people come in and they're hungry and they see the desserts, guess what? The kids take the desserts and then they eat whatever else, right? If you put the desserts at the end of the line, maybe put the salads first, and make the desserts there, you can get them, but maybe a little harder, you have to reach a little higher or something else like that. It turns out that people will eat fewer of the desserts and more of the salads, and if you ask them if they're happy about it, they're fine. They're great with that. That's okay. So it helps them to achieve their goal of losing some weight, if that's what they wanted to do. And if you're an athlete and you can eat all the desserts you want, the desserts are there. So nobody's telling you can't take them. So that's this idea of paternalistic libertarianism. Does it make a little sense? Okay, so let me give you a couple of examples and tell you also that this is now being, just in the last few years, put into action. And there are a number of different governments, what are affectionately called nudge units, but they also have official names, like the Behavioral Insights Team, which is based right in 10 Downing Street in the UK, to try to use these ideas from behavioral economics about how people actually make decisions to nudge them in directions that would make sense for those people. There is also now in the federal government, as of about a couple of weeks ago, something called the Social and Behavioral Science Team. And it comes out of OSTP, but it's actually located now in the General Services Administration to try to use some of these ideas. There's also something called JPAL North America. JPAL is a tremendous organization. It's based at MIT, and they've brought the whole idea, they work on international development. And international development, mostly in the past, if I were to characterize it unfairly, people would say, oh, I have a good idea for what would help this country, let's go try it. And they would try it, and then at the end they'd kind of say, oh, well, that kind of worked, or it didn't work. And the people who founded JPAL said, no, that's not good enough. If you really want to know what works, you got to do randomized control trials. If you want to know whether to give away the mosquito nets or charge a quarter for them so that they really get used, you could imagine arguments one way or another, then you got to randomly give some people mosquito nets, some people not, and charge them, and some people you give it to them for free, and then see how much they use it, and to use that kind of idea. So there's been for years now a JPAL Asia, a JPAL Africa, and there's now a JPAL North America, which is all about testing out policies using this kind of empirical randomized control trial idea in the United States and working closely with federal agencies. There are AAAS and Ideas 42 is another group that works on behavioral economics. Both of them have fellowships for people who are interested in this to come and work in the government, who usually when economists think of going into the government, they think about, I get to decide what the interest rate is going to be or what, those kinds of things. These are behavioral economists who know something about how people actually use data and make decisions. And so there are fellowships like that, and there's also a brand new Behavioral Science and Policy Association. So this is all just in the last few years. So let me give you a couple of examples of the kinds of things they've been doing. And fortunately, my friends in the Cabinet Office in the UK gave me some of their slides that I can show you what they've been doing. So we mentioned before enrollment in retirement plans. So in this country, a lot of employers will match your money, or at least contribute towards your own retirement plan. And it used to be that you would go and they'd sit down on the first day and they would say, okay, here's 5 different plans that you could use, 5 different investments that you could make, and go home and figure out which one you want, and just check it off, and we'll say match your contribution, and this will be great. So what happens? 30% of the people or so return that page, and actually in the United States it's mostly less. In the UK it's about 30% or so, and most people never return. They would never make that decision to opt into this plan. because there are 5 different things. They're going to do it next week and whatever, and it's, who knows, do I want a bond fund or a stock fund or this and that? And they just never get to it. So instead, the idea here is to change the choice architecture by saying to people, okay, here's the story. You are now enrolled by default in this plan. There are five different investment companies you could go with. And if you don't like this one and you say so right now, we'll change it to whatever you want. If you decide tomorrow you want to change it, that's fine. Just tell me. If you don't want to participate at all, just tell me. Now, tomorrow, next week, anytime, you can change it. But if you do nothing, you're in this plan. Okay, so it's an opt-in as opposed to an opt-out, opt-out as opposed to an opt-in. And for a classical economist, this really shouldn't make much of a difference, right? I mean, if it's to your advantage to do this, you know, for a classical economist, for that matter, it wouldn't make much sense for you to walk away and leave this, this form unfilled because you're leaving money on the table that your employer would have matched. So the idea was to just change this to an automatic enrollment and still, in this libertarian way, allow people to move around, to get out altogether if they didn't want to be in it, but to, by default, be opted in. And when you do that, the percentage of overall participation in the workforce beforehand, actually in this example, with their sampling was 61%. As I said, it's lower in the United States. And afterwards, it went up to 83%. And people who were automatically enrolled, very few of them dropped out. So even if on that day they said, okay, sure, I got a lot to think about today, you know, just do it. Very, very few of them later dropped out. And when they survey people and ask them, are you happy that you're saving with for your retirement? They say, oh yeah, no, I'm really happy about it. And these are the same people, if you had said, would you fill in this form and we'll match your money? Never happened, okay? So this is just a way of structuring the policy, and this is now part of the law in the United States, that this is the way pensions are done, that you're by default you're opted in, but you can opt out as, very easily whenever you want. And it's made a huge difference. These are just the figures from the UK. So that's an example of how this gets used. Let me give you another example. I know it's hard to read, but it happens, not everybody's happy about this, but it happens that most governments collect taxes. And if you're in the UK and you don't pay your certain kind of tax, you get a letter from the government and it says, you know, essentially, by the way, we've noticed that you didn't pay your tax and here's how you should, and please do so. And that's what it says. So the behavioral economists thought about this, and they know something about peer norming and things like that, and they did a randomized control experiment. So they sent several different letters to different groups who were randomly assigned one letter of the other. And the main difference was they just added one sentence to this letter. Okay? And the sentence that they added was right up there, and it says, 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time. That's all. Okay? And it's a true number in the UK that 9 out of 10 people pay their taxes on time. And guess what? Just by adding that sentence, they increase the numbers of people who comply. All right, I'll show you the data in a minute. But not being just happy with that, they also went a little bit further, and on some of the letters, they not just asked them about, so this is the control, that a third of them would reply just because they got the plain old letter, the old letter, without any extra things in it. If you said, if you norm this to the whole of the UK and you said that 9 out of 10 people in the UK pay, then it goes up to 35%. So when you take that and take 2% of the people in the UK paying their tax when they didn't before, that adds up to real money. That's enough to pay for a whole behavioral insights team and then some for many, many, many years. So, but then they also went a little further, being behavioral economists. They said, well, you know, that's very nice, 9 out of 10 people, but if you add another sentence that says 9 out of 10 people in the UK have already paid their taxes, and in your neighborhood, 95% of the people have already paid their taxes. Okay? So if you do that local norming, then it goes up. And if you say something about how most people pay their debts, right? And give a number to that, which is a real number, and it goes up from there. And if you say both of them, then it goes up even from there. So just by adding a sentence or two of true facts, these are not made up numbers, they're true facts, and you add them to the letter, then you get this kind of response because you made it easy, attractive, social, and timely. This is when they need to do it, and it's social like that, and you have this kind of peer effect, and so that's what happens just by doing that. And they were able to show this by doing these randomized controlled experiments. Okay, so I'll give you another example. Suppose you wanted people to sign up to be an organ donor. And you wanted to try some different ways of doing it. And I want you to guess which one of these is the most effective. So this is this is the control, right? And when you're on the site, which you're there for other reasons, it just says, thank you, please join the NHS organ donor registry, right? And there's a button there to join. So that's just the plain control, nothing. Okay. So then they thought, well, how do we get more people to do this, or to at least consider doing it? So that's the control. One was to say, every day thousands of people who see this page decide to register. So that's the peer norming. So that's one possibility. That's the second one. The third one was to say the same thing but have a picture of a bunch of people. Okay, so that's the people. And this says also every day thousands of people who see this page decide to register, but it has a picture of a heart. Okay, so there's another one that you can test. This says 3 people die every day because there are not enough organ donors. So there's another possibility. This one says you could save or transform up to 9 lives as an organ donor. And this one says, if you needed an organ transplant, would you have one? If so, please help others. And then the final one said, if you support organ donation, please turn your support into action. All right, so we have the control group. I want you to vote. There's a control group, I'll say it again. Thousands of people, right? There's the thousands of people with a picture of a whole group. You want me to run it past again? Okay, I'll run it past again. Okay, so, yeah, saw that. There we are. So there's the control, doesn't say anything, just says, please join the NHS organ donor. There's the every day thousands of people who see this page decide to register. Okay, that's the peer thing. There's that message with the picture of the people. Okay, you say that? Okay. There's that message with a picture of the heart. You like that one? A couple of people like that one. Okay. There's 3 people die every day because there are not enough organ donors. Yeah, okay, a couple of people think that one will work. All right. You could save or transform up to 9 lives as an organ donor. Okay. More people like that one. If you needed an organ transplant, would you have one? If so, please help others. So again, a bunch of people say that. And if you support organ donation, please turn your support into action. So a few people. Okay, but I think it's fair to say that we just don't know. I mean, some people found some of them more compelling than others, and we just don't know. And the point of behavioral economics, the point of all this empirical stuff, is that you go out and you do the experiment, and you randomly send people one of these 8 different things, and you find out what goes on. So it turns out that the picture, which I actually thought was pretty convincing, is the worst. Doesn't help at all. It's worse than the control, which, okay. And the best of these is, would you have one yourself? And if so, would you help others? Which kind of makes some sense. Okay. All right, so that's the flavor of how these kinds of gathering evidence, of using what we know about behavioral economics and how people actually make decisions, and by trying to make things easy and attractive and social and timely, that you get people to do things. And so now I want to just talk for a minute about, well, what would you do with this? I mean, I gave you some evidence here. You could say, okay, I'll take the one with the highest return. But what should you ask when you look at this data?
Well, a lot of people didn't vote.
So a lot of people never signed up at all, but that's okay. If you can increase it by a few percent, then people are pretty pleased with that. I mean, there are a lot of things that governments do where they go out and say, wow, we're going to do this and it's going to increase this by a percentage or two. It doesn't make any difference at all.
But you're missing 80%.
Yeah, no, that's true. But I mean, should you believe this? That the would you get a donation yourself, that's the best one?
No. You don't know what they would have done if there was.
Okay, but what's the other thing? The other thing is that these numbers are not hugely different, right? So how do you know that it's not just as a result of chance? I mean, you're doing these kinds of, you're doing these kinds of experiments, and should you then base policy on the evidence that you got by doing one experiment like this? So
How much it costs to implement that? I mean,
changing the website costs almost nothing, right? And if you think about it, this is what Google and Amazon and people like that are doing every single day, right? They're running experiments like this where half the people see a green button and half the people see a red button, and if more people click on the red button, then the next day everybody gets the red button. I mean, this is happening all the time. So that costs almost nothing. I mean, it's really remarkably inexpensive. I mean, generally speaking, running a randomized control trial is a very expensive thing, and it's a difficult thing to design and to implement correctly. And I want to say just a few words as we wrap up about why that is and why you have to be a little careful about randomized control trials and about actually science and empiricism altogether. But I want to go back to this question here. Are the results just due to chance? That you happen to send a whole bunch of pictures of the heart to people who didn't like pictures of hearts or something like that? It's random after all. So maybe it's just due to chance. Or are they actually statistically significant, right? I mean, everybody's heard the phrase statistically significant. And you'd really like to know whether this is the case before you apply it very widely to everybody. I mean, it's one thing for individuals, but if you're a policymaker, if you're actually somebody who is posing these decisions to people and deciding about the choice architecture, you really want to know, is this something that I'm going to make a change like this and put it in front of lots of people and hope that it really does better. So you'd like to really know something about comparing the control and the treatment groups and seeing if there's really a big difference. So how do people do that when they're doing this kind of empirical economics, this kind of behavioral research? So there's this whole idea of hypothesis testing. You have a hypothesis, let's just call that H, that the treatment actually matters. That sending them the extra sentence in the tax form actually matters. As opposed to what's usually called the null hypothesis, which is that it doesn't matter. Okay? That nothing helps, that's the null hypothesis. So you want to test those things. Now if you ask me, okay, what do I really want to know when I go out and take this data D? I'd like to know about the probability of the hypothesis that treatment matters given the new data I got, or the probability of the null hypothesis given the new data I got, and see which one of those two is bigger, right? That makes sense to me because I get the data and I want to update it. All right, it's not exactly what people do. What they do, and what statistical significance means, is that you say that the results are statistically significant if the probability of having gotten that data, given the null hypothesis, is very small. So in other words, that the probability of having gotten by chance, given the fact that these things actually didn't make any difference, the probability of having gotten the data that you got would be very, very unlikely. Then you say, I'm going to reject the null hypothesis because this data would have been very unlikely if it was true, and I consider that evidence in support of the actual hypothesis. Let me say this again, because it's related to all the things we talked about before, and you'll see how, but it's a little bit convoluted, right? So you really want to know, I think, what's the probability of the hypothesis given the data, right? But guess what? People actually twist that around when they're doing this, and they look at the probability of the data given the hypotheses, right? And in particular, what people mean by statistically significant is that it would have been tremendously unlikely to get this data if, in fact, the null hypothesis were true. If there was no difference between the treatment and control group, the treatment wasn't really worth anything. And so therefore, I will conclude that the null hypothesis should be rejected because this data would have been very unlikely if it were actually true. So you twist these things around, and if that is by convention, if it's less than 5%, and you've done this randomized control trial, then you declare that you had a statistically significant result, and what do? You go ahead and you publish your paper, right? Because you got a statistically significant result. So you publish your paper. Now, what's the issue with this? Well, there's something called the file drawer problem, which is that, and if you don't get a statistically significant result, what do? You put the paper in the file drawer, right? Because probably nobody's going to publish it. Or if you're a little more clever and a little more ambitious, and you got an insignificant result, then what do?
Publish an article about the significance.
No, you don't do that, because people won't publish it. You keep on running subjects, or you tinker with it, or you do something else. There's a formal phrase for this. That it's called p-hacking, because this is called the p-value. The probability of the data given the null hypothesis is the p-value. And if the p-value is bigger than 5%, then you don't publish. If it's smaller than 5%, then you do publish. And if you look at the published literature, there are lots and lots of things there that are 4.9, 4.95, 4.9999. There's almost nothing in the published literature that's 5.1, that's 5. So if you get a 5.1 result, then you go and you p-hack and you change your experiment a little bit and you do whatever you have to do. So this is well known, and it's very, very bad practice, because what's the story here? So suppose that I did an experiment 100 times. Graduate students are cheap. You do the experiment 100 times. Well, 5% of them are going to come out to look statistically significant, even if it's just by chance, right? So, and those are the ones that are going to be published. The other 95 go in your file drawer, right? So what does that mean? That means that when you look at the published literature, the evidence that's in that published literature is very different and not representative at all of the total amount of evidence that's ever been collected. Okay? And if you work for the FDA and they're doing drug trials and things like that, then the results that are not statistically significant have to get filed, but there's no way that anybody else will ever see them. Okay? Because the drug companies don't want the other drug companies to know that they tried this and it cost money and it didn't work, because they want them to make the same mistake. All right? So that means that the stuff that gets published is published maybe because these are real effects, but maybe because it just happened by chance that these are the 5 out of 100 that were statistically significant because of chance, right? And those are the only ones that end up in the literature, and the other ones are never seen. Okay? So what do you do about this? One of the things that you do is that you start up registries, and this is something that the Sloan Foundation has helped with a little bit, especially in economics. And you make people, before they do the randomized control trial, write down their experimental design. We're going to do this many people, we're going to do it exactly this way, and we're committed to that. And then maybe it never gets published, but at least if you want to do something similar, you can go back and say, hey, you know, there were 10 people who said they were going to do something like the experiment that I want to do, and none of them ever got published. So maybe that means I shouldn't bother, right? Because that's what's going on. And it prevents that kind of p-hacking, where you go in and you say, oh, well, I'll get a few more subjects, or I'll do something else like that. Okay. So this should remind you a little bit about Bayes. And I told you that probability of the data given the null hypothesis is called the p-value. And the power is a test of the power of a test, is the probability of positive data given that H is true. Okay, and typically if you want to know if this is a good test, you usually want that to be 80% by convention. And it just says that the effect size is big enough that you really notice it in the data. That's kind of what it's saying. So these are the two kind of parameters that by convention people use, this 5% for statistical significance and 80% for the power of a test. And that's what you need to do to get published. Okay. However, if you think about this the way that we've been thinking about Bayes, this is an illustration from The Economist magazine from just a few weeks ago. And you might have noticed on the cover of The Economist, it talked about what's wrong with science. Why are so many of the things that are published, why are so many of the things with drugs, why are so many of these empirical findings actually turn out not to be reproducible, they turn out not to really be true? Well, we can understand that using exactly the tools that we've been using up till now, because suppose that you're doing a lot of science and you have 1,000 different tests, and for the sake of argument, The Economist said, suppose 1 out of 10 of those are actually true. So those are the green ones in the upper right. If the tests have a false positive rate of 5%, so that's that p-value, then that means that there are going to be 45 of these, of the ones that are false, that are actually, that look to be true when you look at the data. Okay? Because 5% of the 900 of those things are going to be 45. And if you have a power of 8, then you'll only confirm 80% of those true hypotheses, and you'll get 20 false negatives. So the upshot of all of this is that you will, based on the data, come up with 125 publishable papers, 125 things that say that this is true. But of those 125, 45 of them will actually be false. Okay, so that's the way the number works. And if you wanted to just write it out the way that we've been looking at it, the base rate here is going to be 100 of them versus 900. And that factor, the base factor that you have to write in there to multiply it by is that 0.08 is the power divided by the p-value. And you get that 80 out of 45 of these things is the ratio of the probability of the hypothesis being true given the data versus the probability of the null hypothesis being true given the data. So that means that 80 over plus 45 is 125, and of those, the 45 of them are false. So that's what happens when you try to do this. And that's how Bayes applies to these sorts of things. And this is what you have to think about if you want to use evidence, if you want to use randomized control trial, and if you want to use these kinds of ideas about behavioral economics and how people actually behave. So let me just wrap up by just saying something about what behavioral economics is not about. It's really not about politics. Governments are trying to do something. You might not want them to collect taxes, but they do collect taxes. And if you want to argue about the tax rate, that's another discussion. But given a tax rate, you might as well collect the money that's owed to you, right? So whatever it is that the government is trying to do, you're just trying to actually go out and empirically figure out what would help this work more effectively. It's not about coercion. You're not telling people that they have to do this or that they have to do that. You're just making it easier in this paternalistic libertarian way, but I want to underscore libertarian, for people to do the kinds of things that they say that they want to do, like saving, like dieting, like paying the debts that they owe, and those kinds of things. So it's not about coercion, and it's not about mind control. That's one of the things that every once in a while you read. And it's not really about irrationality. It's not that people are irrational. Nature made us this way, to mix up the probability of A given B with the probability of B given A. And there are evolutionary reasons. There are all sorts of things. And most people behave this way. Even behavioral economists, do these kinds of things. And, I guess if you ask, what if everybody behaved like this? Then I think the best answer to that is from the novel Catch-22, where Yossarian replies, well, if everybody behaved like this, then I'd be a damn fool not to. So that's the point I wanted to make about what behavioral economics is not about. And if you want some more information about any of these things, these are authors who have really done the research, who have really generated a lot of the examples that I talked about, and who are really experts at doing all this. But it's been fun for me getting to know some of these people and to learn about it, and it's been fun sharing that with you. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. So we have time for questions. Please raise your hand, stand, and state your name, whether a member of the society or not, and wait for the microphone to come to you. So let's start with Tom here.
I'm Tom Muller, and I'm a member of the Society. I would just like you to make some comments about the evolutionary aspects of this. How could we have bred ourselves to be people like this?
Well, I think it has to do with noticing coincidences.
Oh,
and
reference.
I'll give you some references, but I think it has to do. There isn't so much written about this that I've read recently, anyway. But I think it has to do with noticing coincidences, and that enables people to make theories. It's really going back to the medical example that I said. Even though the doctor doesn't have a real answer to what you wanted, namely the probability of the birth defect, if you remember, given the exposure, how are you ever going to learn about that? Well, if you begin to notice that when there's that birth defect, there was German measles exposure, right? Then you might formulate a theory. And you might even be right. But you got to do the testing in the way that I described. So in order to formulate theories like that, you want to notice things that really don't necessarily hold up. And a lot of them will turn out to be wrong, but a few of them could be really very useful. I mean, for example, if you're out in the savannah and you notice that 2 or 3 days in a row in the afternoon, the lions are below that tree over there, that could be a complete coincidence. But the fact that you noticed it and took note, that could really be very evolutionarily significant. So it's that kind of an argument, that our brains just kind of wire that way, and that we see associations and not causality. But based on the associations that we notice, you can explore the causality.
Thank you. Somebody on the other side.
Thank you. Dave Rabinowitz, I'm a member of the Society. Haven't these concepts been known, understood, and applied for decades by advertising people?
Absolutely.
And people who write questionnaires for surveys?
Absolutely.
And is there any sort of communication, any people in economics actually studying advertising from that point of view? And a second comment is, if you look at the way commercial firms, especially software companies, would handle that decision to organ transplant, they would have a checkbox which was pre-checked and a continue button. So it's an opt-out instead of opt-in.
Right, right.
And they didn't try that, I guess.
No, the companies know a lot about this, and the advertisers, and I hinted at that when I said, if you've been to a grocery store, then you've noticed that the candy is over there by the checkout line at eye level for the kids, right? So that isn't like an accident. People really thought about what works there, and it's really the same principle. The difference is that was called marketing, and this is called behavioral economics. The other difference is that there are now names for these things. You talk about the confirmation bias, the anchoring bias, and other sorts of things like that. And that it's, the serious difference is that these things are openly investigated and published about. So that people can argue about it, so that it's not just a kind of a black art that's going on. And that if it doesn't work, that people can try to reproduce these experiments and so on and so on. And very specifically, as to whether the behavioral economists talk to marketing people, the Sloan Foundation, together with the Russell Sage Foundation, runs a whole working group on behavioral economics and consumer finance. So this was part of our response to the financial crisis, that we really should understand what's going on with these mortgages and lending and who's fooling who and what's going on. So that group was very specifically put together with a bunch of behavioral economists, a bunch of finance people, a bunch of marketing people, and the conversations there have been really terrific. So that is happening, and a lot of this, I completely would say, are things that marketers have known in their bones for a long time, but they haven't done the experiments in the kind of serious way that are publicly available, that I've been talking about. So these become more, a subject of scholarly discourse than, marketing professors have, to be sure, but professional marketers haven't necessarily done that because they have an interest in keeping it to themselves.
Hi, Carl Merrill, a member of the Society. You gave the example, a medical example. One of the concerns I have with the medical is that a physician might read 5 journals a week or month and then try to come up with treatments for a patient, very often with these kinds of biases. But I understand IBM has a program using Watson, the computer, that's using this type of Bayesian type of analysis to act as an aid to the physician. So it seems to me that that's the only way medicine ought to be practiced. And so how do we convert medicine so it's practiced?
First of all, it's a pretty good doctors that are reading 5 journals a week. Right? But certainly the machines are in sometimes much better at doing this, at doing the formal analysis. But still human beings have hunches. They have other kinds of ways of intuiting and noticing things that sometimes the models don't. And so I wouldn't want to entrust myself, this is just for my own personal preference, entirely over to Watson. But having Watson there next to the physician, man, you're crazy not to try to use that, I think. So, and the more data that we can collect about these sorts of things, the better it would be. And it's precisely behind all the good programs like that is precisely this kind of Bayesian analysis and precisely that formula that I wrote up there.
And you can say the same thing about politics too.
Well,
Decisions.
So in the back there.
Hello, I'm Matthew Zivit. I'm not a member of the Society. The idea of people ignoring the base rates and using behavioral economics in decision making reminds me of the debate over breast cancer screening. So there was this debacle. People said, they did research and they said, well, for under a certain age, if you look at the base rates, the test for breast cancer is not informative. And the public said, well, we don't care.
Right.
So when you turn to people and you say, well, everyone ignores base rates, but when you look at them, this test that you take is uninformative, and the public says, we don't care, we want to continue ignoring base rates, how do you convince them to care about them?
So as I said, even people who study these things find it hard to police themselves in such a way as to completely overcome a lot of these biases. And I also want to very highly recommend the book by Dana Kahneman on thinking fast and slow. And the idea that in certain circumstances, being able to just, as I said, easily and quickly come up with something is very useful. I mean, if there's a lion chasing you or something like that, you don't want to do a big Bayesian analysis of this and take a lot of data about what to do. And so these things run deep, and it's hard to really completely police them out of your mind. Police them out of your mind, that's a funny way of putting it. But you know what I'm trying to say. But nevertheless, if you're aware of it, and it's an important decision, about a surgery or about some medicine or something else like that, then being able to read the literature and talk to people in this way ought to be helpful. But it isn't like, you hear about this once or twice and you say, okay, I'll never do that again, and that's it. It's really more complicated than that, which is why a machine might help you.
Public policy is about convincing the public. The public has to agree with the decisions that you make, and if you can't bring the public along.
So that's where I think these randomized control trials are really pretty convincing. Because it's not a matter of, I think this is going to make a difference to how people pay their taxes, or, we don't believe in this, or we do believe in this, or anything else like that. You go out and you do the randomized control trial, and, you come back and you say, okay, if you do this, then so many people respond. If you do that, then so many people respond. Now, what do you want to do? And so I think that is actually pretty powerful, and it's not really been used much in government. It really hasn't before. The UK has pioneered this. Lots of other countries are setting up these kinds of nudge units and behavioral and empirical units like this, and I think it's actually really quite encouraging. I think if the politics can sometimes ever be swayed by some sort of rational process, then something like this ought to be able to do it. And there are cases where it's happening.
Let's get the gentleman here. Wait for the microphone.
Oh, okay.
Wait for the microphone.
Oh,
Microphone.
Thanks. Paul Guy, a non-member. I'd like to know, on the data, your own data concerning, or somebody's data, the increase in organ donor sign-up. If you applied that data to the null hypothesis test, what results did you get? Did you do it? And if so, what were your results?
So the idea was that the hypothesis was that if you add a few sentences, that you would get a bigger. Oh, you're asking about the statistical significance?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Okay. I asked. I see. Okay. You're asking about the statistical significance of that, and exactly. I asked that question of the people in the UK, and they said, well, we're working on that. But what I can tell you is, and they are working on it, they'll have a better answer for that. Not all, they do have the sample size up there and a whole lot of information, so it's not an impossible calculation to make. And these are not, they didn't ask 10 of their best friends. They went out and asked thousands of people, they tried to do this right. But I can tell you that the group that's being set up through the GSA to do this is absolutely intent on making sure that all of the statistical analysis is done, that all the sample sizes are checked, that the significance is checked, that the power calculations are done, and everything else like that, because, it's the right thing to do, first of all. And secondly, because if there's going to be any kind of political debate over this, you want to make sure that you've done your homework and you've got everything straight. And so that's one of the reasons why they're working with this group like JPAL North America, which has some very distinguished empirical scientists involved with it, who are serving as consultants and getting everything set up to begin with. When you try to look after the fact, well, did we do all this right? That's not a good thing. You want to plan and design and commit to a particular way of doing these experiments in advance, and that's exactly what they're doing.
We got to do it over again.
Let's try here. Joseph.
I should say on the retirement data, there's no question that it's statistically significant, and that's been redone many, many, many times. On the organ donation, I'm not sure what the error bars are, but many, many of these other things are extremely robust and have been done in different countries, and the retirement data is on people's participation. That's extremely significant, very large effects, and very reproduced.
I'm Joseph Colomer, I'm a member. You presented several different things, I think, at least two. One is related to how to measure things, so statistical significance, Bayesian. So all this is very interesting and has a lot of implications for policy making, as you said. But the other part is about how people behave with misinformation or biased information, or they are victims of advertising, or what you said about the taxes, etc. This is kind of different thing because it's about people behaving.
It wasn't misinformation, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, no.
I mean,
so
the carnival wheel actually said that
incomplete or imperfect information that they make people behave in a different way. And then some people say that this happens, especially among people who unexperienced, young, uneducated people. I mean, the people who deviate from the standard assumptions in traditional economics are people with lower experience or lower education. So
I didn't say that, but go ahead.
Even Kahneman, for instance, that you just mentioned, the examples that he put is so people think fast for low-stake things, but when the stakes are high, most people tend to think so slow. Mm-hmm. No, I think does it make sense to you?
Yeah. So first of all, I'll say again that the data that we were talking about was not false data. It wasn't misleading data. The carnival wheel really said that. I mean, it's just what people do with that data. Secondly, I wasn't suggesting at all that these are people who really can't, aren't very good at making decisions or anything else. I said all of us do this. And in fact, there's a bunch of behavioral economists who wrote I think a very important paper, and it has to do with which side is which. You can hear easily in political talk these days that people are poor because they've made bad decisions. It's kind of their fault. They have to take the consequences, and it's not my problem. This research, and it's a book called Scarcity that I recommend to you very highly. And what they found is that actually it's the other way around. That if you're in a position of scarcity, if you're poor, you make bad decisions. Okay? And that they took people at fancy universities who, under normal circumstances, are actually very good at playing games and doing all sorts of simulations and everything else like that, and they put them in conditions of scarcity where they have very little time or very little resources to allocate for this game, and they begin making very bad decisions, right? And the quick thinking takes over, and your instincts take over, and the decisions that they were able to make just fine beforehand, before this condition of scarcity, that is, make them terrible decision makers. And so it isn't so much that, that people didn't get an education or something and therefore they're poor. It's rather that if you are, worried about how to feed your kids, you got to take a long bus ride to work, you can't pay your insurance, all these sorts of things are on your mind, and then you say, how come you're not saving for retirement? Right? Well, they're not saving for retirement. I mean, who can think about all that stuff? Because we have limited bandwidth. And so it's, again, one of these cases of what causes what. And you want to think about it very carefully. And they give that kind of evidence and have done a number of experiments in different kinds of contexts. But with people who, under normal circumstances, are great decision makers, become very, very poor and are much more prone to all these kinds of biases and shortcuts and things that really don't make sense, and that they wouldn't do under other circumstances.
Let's see one in the back there.
My name is Brandon Ruttman, and I'm a non-member here. The way I think about behavioral economics is basically it is a handbag of various phenomena that are not particularly well connected to each other. And I tend to think that the way you could connect them is to use, as what the first questionnaire alluded to, was an evolutionary framework. Mm-hmm. And as you also mentioned, there's not much research in this vein, although I think it would be a particularly productive avenue to not only connect everything, but also to better understand how they work. I guess my first question is, do you agree with this perspective? And where would you suggest a person who has this perspective find resources to pursue this research, especially if this person does not have a PhD?
So first of all, from what I said, and the little suggestions that I made as to why our brains might be wired this way, of course I agree with it. And I also said that I picked and I selected and chose some special examples from behavioral economics, by no means comprehensive. And part of that is because, exactly as you say, behavioral economics is largely a bunch of examples. And it doesn't quite have an overarching theory to it. People are getting better and better at thinking about these things, and we now have toolkits, and enough that you can have a behavioral science team or a nudge unit or something like that looks at a situation and says, yeah, okay, let's try this. I have some ideas of what might work here, and we'll go out and try it. So it's beginning to become much more of a real science and a real field and all the rest of that. But there is a lot of work to be done. And I think it's exciting work, and an evolutionary point of view, it's got to have something to do with it. And as far as where to look for that, there are people all around who are studying such things, and I'm glad to, talk to you a little further and make a few connections later if you like. I mean, I suppose the answer I'm supposed to give is that you could write to the Sloan Foundation. But I already said that the views I'm expressing are not necessarily those of the Sloan Foundation. So even if I said that, you shouldn't believe me.
Let's try a couple more questions as it gets late. Do you have a question over there? Yeah, go ahead.
Ms. Ambrose, non-member. So everyone knows that when people are observed, they act differently. My first question is, has there been any research as to if people know that they're being nudged, do they act differently? I'm just thinking from personal experience. I know that they put the nice candy right at the checkout aisle, and I purposely don't get it because I don't want to give in to that strategy. And more broadly, how do you respond to the charge of social engineering? Because I know that the examples you gave, okay, everyone agrees that investing in retirement is a good thing. Being an organ donor is a good thing. But I think some people could see these sorts of techniques being used to nudge people in different ways. And I know particularly when the US started saying that they'd have this unit that would start doing this sort of behavioral economics, that it got some press as to, nanny state sort of thing. So how do you respond to people nudging back against being nudged?
So I wouldn't say that people could use this for other kinds of purposes that are perhaps not as wholesome or not so easy to agree on. I would say that they're doing that every day, right? And that the marketers are doing it to make money, and that's their job. God bless them, right? But people are doing it for all sorts of reasons. And so we're being manipulated like this all the time. And sometimes we're aware of it, sometimes we're not, sometimes we resist, sometimes we don't. It's all very complicated. And but why not, if this is happening all the time for all sorts of other reasons, be they monetary or political or whatever, why not also use it just to make some of the things that have to get done work a little bit better? And to help people, as I put it, do the things that they say they want to do but find it a little hard to do, like dieting or saving for retirement or something like that. So that's all. I would say that it's happening all the time anyway, and why not use some of this to do this? Now, as far as the representativeness of these samples, there is a real problem with all kinds of psychology, that most of it has been done in the past using undergraduates. Because at pretty good universities, because those are the ones that are available, and you bring them into the lab and you do things. That's really changing a lot. And I should also mention there's some terrific projects that are going on to reproduce the findings in psychology, the top findings in top journals, and you know, some of them reproduce and some of them don't. But part of it is that it's a very special kind of a sample like that. And it's become much easier using the internet, using lots of other kinds of techniques to do larger samples that aren't just undergraduates. And so, and these findings tend to be pretty robust. I mean, so just to give you a specific example from that book, Scarcity, some of the examples are about, you know, undergraduates at fancy universities who are playing video games and simulations and things like that. Some of the examples are about farmers in India. And after the harvest, when they have a lot of time and money, they make very good decisions. You know, they save, they get themselves organized, they do all sorts of things. And then after, you know, when it's before the harvest, and they don't have many resources left, and they're scrambling around and trying to do things, the very same people are making really not very good decisions at all. Okay, so that's a field trial. This is not undergraduates. These are real people who are, you know, they're not trying to fool anybody or anything else like that. They're just living their lives. And when you look at those kinds of things, so there's now, I think, quite a broad mix of different kinds of samples and different kinds of experiments like that, including really lots of honest-to-goodness field trials and much less reliance on things in laboratories.
Okay, one last question. Let's see here, Mike.
Mike Dole, I'm a new member tonight. I hope asking a question doesn't jeopardize that. The example of the stockbroker and picking 1 and 4, that is, going up and did it, doesn't that assume that there's a 50% probability? If the base rate is, if they're riding a great bull market or bear market, if you pick that category of going up or going down, they're going to have a fabulous rate, even if they're making 50% guesses.
Right. So that the force of that, I mean, I take your point, but the force of that particular example was simply about what kind of evidence do you need in order to check the statement that if he says it's going to go up, that it actually does go up. And it actually had nothing to do with probability whatsoever, the way I stated it. And the point of it was that people don't check all the evidence that they should, because they only want to know, well, if he said it went up, what happened, right? Really, but if you want to check that, what you have to know is, gee, if it went down, did he ever the week before say that it was going to go up? Because that would then falsify the claim.
Right.
So people ignore the evidence, certain kinds of evidence, and they only look for certain kinds of evidence. And that was the force of that example. It really wasn't about probability, and it wasn't really about the stock market. It was just...
If I can just make one other comment.
Sure.
As a social science professional, when we were undergraduates, if you got a 0.05, you got the smallest number of people possible to eke that out. And if you happen to get a 0.01, you built a cathedral on the spot.
Right.
But you're dealing with such small samples that by the time you take it out to 1 million people, God knows what's going to happen. That's how come social science publishes so much silliness with a 0.05 on 100 people compared to Google and Microsoft, who can do it on 1 million.
Exactly.
And get paid more.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons why we have the luxury to take up these kinds of examples that we talked about and that even The Economist magazine talked about. I mean, if I were talking a few hundred years ago and I said, okay, imagine doing 1,000 experiments like this. And people in the Explorers Club would say, 1,000 experiments? That would take lifetimes and, you know, huge amounts of resource and things like that. We can do 1,000 experiments in a couple of seconds on the web. So the scale of all this has changed dramatically, and it opens up what we can think about. And absolutely, you're right, that having very large samples like this, dare I say big data, right, makes it possible to really think about these kinds of things in a different way. And if you are only doing 1 or 2 experiments, then the idea that 0.05, that 5% of them might by chance have ended up in the literature, you only did a few of them, who cares? If you're doing 100 of them, though, you're going to get 5 things that could have been there just by chance. And if you're doing thousands of them, then you're going to have a lot of things that are in the literature that are there by chance, not because there's a real effect. And so you're absolutely right that the scale of all of this is part of what's driving people to be so concerned about these things. And I think it's kind of exciting.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.